towards the Rococo, and as you'll see from our timeline, we have moved out of the 1600s and we are now kind of squarely in the 1700s from about 1715 to 1770. And there's a very specific reason why we're looking at 1715. So there are tons of historical events to talk about. 1715 is important because that's when Louis XIV dies, and we'll see how his death affected the art world. Following his death, the family quarrels broke out as they did when he was a child. There was a regency council that had been created by his nephew, Philippe II of Orleans. He ruled until his great-grandson, Louis XV, came of age. So Louis XIV ruled for 72 years, so the next in line was his great-grandson. Interestingly, Louis XV ruled for like 59 years, and his grandson was Louis XVI, whose head was cut off during the French Revolution. But we'll talk about that later on in this chapter. Also, around this time, Voltaire, who was venerated as a great thinker, was charged with many crimes. He was imprisoned for including a line of verse in a play accusing the king of committing incest with his daughter. But if you know anything about philosophy or France in the 18th century, you'll know that Voltaire is very important. He mainly argued for religious tolerance and freedom of thought. He campaigned to eradicate priestly and monarchical authority and supported a constitutional monarchy that protects people's rights. And if all of that sounds familiar, like freedom of speech and freedom of religion, it's because a lot of Voltaire's ideas made their way into our Constitution. There's also Diderot, who we'll talk about more at the end of chapter 30 as well, but he gave us the encyclopedia, the first sort of comprehensive book of knowledge that gave the power to change men's common way of thinking. The work combined scholarship with information on trades, and Diderot emphasized the abundance of knowledge within each subject area, so everyone would benefit from these insights. So this is the first time we see somebody collecting or trying to collect every piece of information out there. He's the first Google. The last thing on there is the 7 Years' War, and that was a global war. It's kind of one of the first. That resulted in a number of alliances that shaped future events, like the American War of Independence, because the French wanted revenge against the English, because they lost land, the land distribution in North America, the Louisiana Territory, Canada, etc. It shaped the French Revolution, which was a direct result of helping America overthrow the King of England, and the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, in which Napoleon attempts world domination in order to thwart the power of Britain. So this seemingly inconsequential war, sometimes called the French Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, was instrumental in sort of shaping the 19th century and the latter part of the 18th century. We'll talk about it a little bit, but not really in this lecture. I just want you to know that that event is out there. New century, and so there's no other works from the last century on here. It's all new stuff. We will look at paintings by Watteau, Boucher, Fragonard, and we'll look at a room by Beaufrand, which is typical of architecture during the Rococo period in France. And of course, here we are again in France, talking about not Louis XIV's Palace of Versailles, but a whole bunch of new stuff. Okay, so here's the story. Louis XIV dies and his great-grandson takes over, but he doesn't have the power to control the nobles like Louis XIV used to, so they start leaving Versailles and they build big fancy houses in Paris, and these fancy houses are known as hôtels, which looks like hotels with a weird triangle over the O. They need to decorate these giant fancy homes, and the style they choose has come to be known as Rococo. So what is it? It's the French late adaptation of Baroque. It's a combination of the words rocaille and Baroque. Its style, I would best describe it as pretty, dainty, saccharine, filled with pastels. It's full of eroticism and risque images, which we will talk about today. It's theatrical like the Baroque, but for a very private audience. It's not a PR campaign in order to win over converts, but this is just for the French nobility. It's like their own little show. This seems like almost a natural evolution of having 7 years of the arts cater to royalty and nobility. I feel that Rococo is a bit disingenuous, and when we talk about stucco, you'll know what I mean, but basically stucco is just like cement that's most supposed to look like marble, and it's the main ingredient in interior design. And there's a video for you to watch, which is kind of fascinating on how people create sculpture using stucco. So while the Rococo is happening and these people are building these fancy houses and having this whimsical, erotic art, something else is happening in France, which was a direct result of the Protestant Reformation, and that is the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment comes directly from the Protestant Reformation because it's the first movement to expound upon what happens if we question how to worship God. Well, what else is up for debate? And the idea of who rules over you and how they rule over you becomes up for debate. And other things like questions about shouldn't there be reason over superstition? Shouldn't there be empiricism or, finding the truth over faith? Shouldn't natural law rule over man-made law? Shouldn't democracy win over monarchy? Another question is God an interloper who is in your business all the time? Or is God the watchmaker who just kind of sets the clock and lets it go? And finally, there is a middle class emerging as a result of global trade, industrialization, banking, and scientific innovation. And we saw this in the Netherlands when we talked about their art market. But in France, the middle class didn't have actual social standing. And so if taxes were raised, they would disproportionately hit these increasingly wealthy people. Thereby, the middle class started to resent the nobility. And they resented the church because the church was also exempt from taxation. So here again, we have this swirling soup of different ideas, kind of like the Renaissance or during the Reformation. And I like to think of the Rococo period as a time of pretty pictures and gilded rooms that blinded the nobility to their inevitable downfall. It's like the story of Nero in ancient Rome who was playing the lyre while Rome burns. And it's kind of like what we're doing today is taking a really earnest look at the workmanship and the sound quality of that lyre as opposed to thinking about like Rome burning, etc. So let's find some beauty in that lyre while keeping in mind that the revolution is coming and some of these people and or their descendants will soon lose their heads. All right, here's a typical room of a Rococo hotel. This is known as the Salon de la Princesse in the Hôtel du Soubise. So what happens is the court leaves Versailles after the death of Louis XIV, which I said. They go back to Paris and the Tuileries Palace, and that's the center of Paris, the Tuileries Palace, which is close to the Louvre. Nobles update and build private residences. It's the center of social life and gatherings and salons. So before it used to be Versailles. If you wanted to have your friends over, you would invite them to your room at Versailles or you would walk the gardens. But now they have these entire sort of big homes that have these rooms in which you gather and you discuss intellectual and cultural pursuits. And they were well-educated rich people, so they were talking about things that mattered. They were talking about Voltaire and the Enlightenment, but they weren't really understanding how it was going to affect them. They almost felt immune to the effects of the Enlightenment. As you look at this, you can see there's gold that goes across expanses of whites and pastels, and there are mirror reflections, and there's delicate ornamentation in the stucco, which again is a form of cement that you paint or you put gold leafing on, which is supposed to look like sculpture, like it's been carved, but really it's just built up, basically cement. There are things called boiseries, which are carved wooden panels. And a lot of the images that you see, or even in the stucco itself, like there are sculptures of things, or sculpted stucco, are pictorial themes from classical love stories. And that's what we're going to get into, is where these paintings go, what they look like, and why they look like they do. And a lot of them are based on classical Greek and Roman mythology. The first originator of, I guess, Rococo style painting would be Watteau. And he made these paintings called Fête Galante, which just means like a party out in the woods. And they're scenes and there's decorously amorous play. Everyone is elegantly attired. Everyone is happy and paired off. The landscape is perfect. The painting is infused with mythology. There are putti, which are those little flying angel babies. There's a statue of Venus in there. The Academy, founded under Louis XIV, didn't have a category for paintings like this. So because Watteau was so popular and the nobility flocked to him, they had to invent a category instead of rejecting Watteau. So this is an example of the institution changing for an artist as opposed to an artist specifically painting in the style the Academy says is the style to paint in. And even in the hierarchy that we looked at during the Dutch painting, the style surpassed landscape. And it satisfied two goals for Watteau. Now that the Academy has accepted this style, he could sell to the nobility, and he also gained credibility. So it was like this virtuous cycle. Okay, so now we have to talk about what is the pilgrimage to Cythera. So Cythera is the island in which Venus, the goddess of love, first landed from the sea. It's like the island where she was born. And so they call it the island of love. And the idea is that you travel there to meet your perfect mate. Strangely, though, the people in this painting, they seem to be coming back from Cythera as opposed to going there. And this is evident because they're all paired up. It seems like they've already met their perfect mate. So the interesting thing is Watteau never clarified this. He never said, oh yeah, that's the truth or whatever. He just sort of let it be. But this mystery isn't really the point. I mean, this is a painting about fantastical love that would have hung in a room where nobles would have had fascinating conversations about it, all the while avoiding the problems brewing in society. It's like how I watch all the Marvel movies all the time and I try not to think about climate change. It's that same mindset of escapism. There are little details in this that are kind of interesting too. I mean, they're in this forested area getting off of a boat or getting on a boat, and there's no dirt on these people. They are clean. And it's like they're wearing the same clothes as the nobles that would have been looking at this. There's that little dog, which indicates fidelity. A dog is a symbol of fidelity. And the audience would have recognized all these things and appreciated it. And that's why Watteau's style became the number one requested painting style. And this is how Rococo sort of snowballed because of this idea of frivolity, fantasy, all wrapped up in classical Greek and Roman mythology. Here's another painting by Watteau, and a little trick for your friends if you ever go to a museum and you're like, I know that this is from the Rococo, because it's generally a scene of people having a party out in the forest, and there's always some sort of Greek or Roman statue nearby. And so those three elements are going to give you Rococo. People having fun, or seemingly having fun, Roman or Greek statue, forest. Now, Watteau has a specific style, which we'll see other Rococo painters sort of abandon, which is this brushiness, this really softness, a haziness. And an interesting thing about Watteau also is there almost feels like there's a melancholy to this. And it could be that idea of the same thing with still lifes, with flowers, is that this joy will not last. It's like a form of nostalgia. Like, remember the time when you were youthful, and love and eroticism and all that stuff, because it's fleeting. And so even though Watteau can be seen as sort of the creator of this dainty, frivolous style, there still is something sort of emotional in there. And you can see why that was attractive to these well-educated nobles. Next up is Boucher, who was the court painter, or the royal painter to Louis XV. And there is a painting of a young girl on a couch, which you'll see in your book. I'm not really going to talk about it. But Boucher did a lot of things. He was a consultant to the manufacturers of tapestry and other products for the home. So he was the Nate Berkus of interior design for the Rococo. In that I mean he was a person that did a lot of different things in their homes. He pushed Watteau's style into a more virtuoso manner. I mean, he's more of a Poussiniste than a Rubiniste, in which he seems to embrace the idea of line over color. And he incorporates this intimacy and playful eroticism and sort of elevates Rococo to the level of the divine. In other words, he takes Watteau's people and turns those people into the mythological creatures themselves. This is the toilet of Venus, but this was an actual woman. So this is where you get this idea of we'll look at it more, but it's called grand manner paintings, in which you take an actual person and put them into a Greek or Roman story. Here's another painting, another Venus, and there's that melancholy that we saw in Watteau is missing here. I mean, this is triumphal hedonism. This is embracing and celebrating the naked human figure. And again, these are hanging in the rooms of these nobles, and they're standing in front of them, and they're talking about them, and they're critiquing them, etc. And this was the style in 1740 that was really taking hold. What I'm fascinated with from Boucher, though, is that I'd earlier said he had developed the Poussiniste, the emphasis on line. But if you look at those bodies, they are Rubenesque. And so he looks like he's trying to combine those two styles, which I think is what a lot of painters do. They look at the past and they say, what are the best things out there, and how can I incorporate them all into my works of art? And so Boucher is embracing line, but also embracing cellulite, the master of flesh. He's trying to work that into these paintings as well. Okay, so we're going to leave it with Boucher for this first lecture, and then we're going to pick up on the last Rococo artist that made like a big dent, and we're going to go into depth onto one of his most famous paintings, probably the most famous painting of the Rococo, and it's Fragonard's The Swing.